So we're going to go and review each of these kinds of learning. And then I want to actually, I'm going to be testing you on telling the difference between different types of learning and with some of the terminology within them. So classical conditioning, remember, is learning by what? Trigger association, right? And you have the example of dogs naturally reacting to the smell of food by salivating, but then they started salivating to the bell that always rang before the food came out, right? They learned to associate it with the food, and so it would produce all by itself the conditioned response of salivating. Okay, so remember in that example what conditioning means in psychology. So when we look at these four terms and how to teach them apart: unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. Remember, unconditioned means unlearned, and conditioned means learned. So what we're talking about is there are a lot of things that you respond to naturally. You never had to be taught, for instance, how to respond to food by salivating. So it isn't just dogs that do that, humans do too, but it's a lot more noticeable in dogs because they tend to drool, okay? So, but the smell of food, that's in response, it's an unconditioned stimulus, and it's responded to in a way you didn't need to learn. It's unlearned, right? Unconditioned response, salivating. And then conditioned stimulus in the example is something that gets connected or paired or associated with the unconditioned stimulus with food. In this example, it was a bell. So the bell is the conditioned stimulus. That's the one that had to be learned, right? But once they figured out it was always going right before the food, that they would get fed after that bell. Okay, then they had the conditioned response of salivating to the bell. Okay, so we're going to practice your ability to pull all of these terms out of each example. So you're not identifying one of these for each one of these. You're identifying all four for each of these 6 examples of learning. Classical learning in particular. Okay, so you've got 6 examples down here, and for each one, you're going to write down your shorthand answer for all 4 of these. If you do them in this order, you don't have to write UCS and UCR down. Just list them in this order. Okay, so one more thing before you start this one, and that is that sometimes you need to infer the unconditioned response. Okay, so when when dad returns, the baby acts excitedly. We're actually told here that the baby acts excitedly, right? And then starts acting the same way when the dog barks. So, but on this second one, you're not told what the initial reaction was, but you can infer that this child cried. In other words, I've never seen a little kid who's bitten by a dog who didn't cry before. So we can safely infer the conditioned response to be crying because of the bite. All right, so you have 2 minutes, see how many of these you can get. Remember, for each 6 of these, you're going to write down all 4 of these. Ready and go. You have about 1 minute left. Okay, so let's see how you did on these. Number one, I'm just going to say them in order, so I'm not going to say UCS, UCR, but I will do the order here. So the 4 answers for number 1 are dad returns, excitement, the dog bark, and dada, saying dada. So think about this, you on an exam, for instance, will show your learning of this through multiple choice. So if yours was close and you put bark instead of dog bark, no big deal, right? You're still going to be able to identify it when you look at the multiple choice answers. Okay, so number two is bites, cries, dogs, and fear. And I do want to pause here a moment just to point out the fact that no child is born afraid of dogs. If they are afraid of dogs, it is something that they learned. Okay. And so this is one way that they might learn a fear of dogs. Okay. Number 3 is through classical conditioning. So number 3 is food, squawks to food, treat jar, squawks to the jar. And I'm just saying to the food and to the jar with that unconditioned response and conditioned response. If it's the same word, that way you can prove you know which one they're squawking to, right? At that particular time, the food or to the jar. Number 4 is shots, cries. Again, we can infer that, whimpers, cries. You pick out the right one. Cat taxi and cries, right? In this case, they're crying to cat taxi. And so again, there's no such thing as a cat who is born afraid of a cat taxi. But they can learn this by associating it to something that they feel is negative, like getting shots at the back, right? Now, number 5 is getting hit, pain, or ow, or you'd be able to quickly infer what the reaction would be, right, to getting hit. The sight of the bully is a conditioned stimulus, and then ducks is a conditioned response. And number 4 is dental work, pain, dentist, and heartbeat quickens. Same idea, right? There's no child that's born afraid of the dentist, but they certainly can learn that over time, right? Okay. So here's my favorite example of classical conditioning. So you've seen a lot of examples about how this is happening consistent all the time. We're surrounded by classical conditioning. Not only are we classically conditioning others every time we praise them or show disapproval for something, right? But we're also being classically conditioned by others, okay? And we see examples of how classical conditioning can work through with animals and of other species, and also with human beings. This, in fact, example is from as you can see on the picture, the show, The Office. Here we go. Okay, so a great example of classical conditioning in action.